92nd Street Y online media is made possible by the generous support of listeners like you. This program features a reading by Nadine Gordimer and was recorded April 24th, 1961, before a live audience at New York's 92nd Street Y.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to read you two stories. The first one I'm going to read you is called A Style of Her Own. They envied her dignity. It gave them something to talk about as they sat on the veranda on fine days and on rainy days in the lounge of the private hotel. Money, that's it, one of them always said. It's easy to go about like a queen when you can afford it. Most of the other old ladies disagreed with this view. One look at the poor old thing who'd said it. They thought of each other as poor old things, but each exempted herself from this generalization. One look was enough to convince you. Rothschild's millions couldn't make a queen out of her. She was one of those who had bad legs and whose board and lodging was paid by the contributions of her children. "It's got to be born in you," said another, sagely. She'd always mixed with what she called a better class type of person, and she felt she knew. "She's got the looks, too, you must remember," another one always reminded them. She herself had a large, fat face that had never found room for a wrinkle, though her body had gone inert under the weight of age, and she never got further than the 5 yards from the lift to the sofa that stood between the reception desk and the door. "She looks every day of her age," said one who believed that she herself didn't. Under 2 hairnets, her rich red curls never dulled, and she even powdered the old lady's hump of flesh at the back of her neck, where the diamante clasp of her pearls rested. They sat beached, with their feet crossed on the maroon carpet, and watched Mrs. Clara Hanson come in from the street. "Have a nice afternoon, dear." The enormous, smiling face of the woman at her usual seat on the sofa at the entrance called out her inevitable greeting. But Mrs. Hanson only smiled slightly, and murmuring an acknowledgment, passed on to the dim maroon vista of the passages. Her ankles were slim. She wore narrow, laced-up shoes that they thought were old-fashioned, and she wasn't painted that you could see. Her face, beneath one of her pale, expensive hats, was exactly the colour and texture of the well-washed white doeskin gloves that she wore. It was a beautiful face, with a rather bloodhound look that comes with the sagging of even the finest tissue. The eyes were grey, speckled, commanding, the bridge of the nose was high, and the mouth was weary. It was said that she still had her own teeth. No one dared ask her whether this was true. There was nothing at all like her in the bilious corridors beneath naked bulbs outside the numbered rooms, where chintz curtains hid the wash basins, and the air was a patchouli of old clothes. In the dining room, with the slimy-stemmed asters in a blue glass vase on each table. In the lounge, where the gilded cane basket of pink gladioli stood over a worn patch on the mustard and green carpet, and the springs of the sofas and easy chairs nudged your flesh. Of course, the hotel was not her sort of place at all. She did not stay at private hotels, but at old, large, expensive public ones, intimidating as museums to those who had not been coming to them for years, as she had, all over the world. She had been led to come to the private hotel in Johannesburg by misinformation, as she quietly put it, her eyelids drooping and her voice dying away. She had not liked the large Johannesburg hotel she'd stayed at on her last visit to the city. It was full of tourists with their cameras and their children, both bumped me about constantly in the lifts, and she supposed all the others were as little to her taste. The man at the tourist agency in London had been stumped, and then, looking through his files, had produced, with special references, the Barrett tromp. She'd not cared much for the sound of it, but then she didn't care much for Johannesburg anyway. She really only liked places that she'd been visiting since she was a child, and that she felt knew her very well. So she gave in quite suddenly and said it would serve. Once she arrived at the place, she realized that it would scarcely do, that this complex of old houses, joined by passages where the electric lights had to burn all day, and the patchwork of worn carpets, each laid to hide the baldness of the other, might be suspected of cosily harbouring cockroaches. She was appalled at the rows and rows of old ladies, creeping or puffing or stooping about. "It is disgusting," she wrote to Europe, "to see how we fall to pieces while we are still alive." And the nasal voice of the little Indian who went through the public rooms with a sandwich board, calling out the names of people who were wanted on the telephone. But she had come to Johannesburg to make some complicated arrangements about her mining investments that would take a month or two at the most, and then would release her once and for all from the necessity of coming to Johannesburg, or even South Africa for that matter, ever again. And so she decided it was not worthwhile to move to some other hotel. And the distastefulness of the Barrett-Tromp Residential Hotel, along with the irksome visits to lawyers and revenue officers, seemed to her a fitting end to her connection with South Africa, a last and therefore almost pleasurable trial wrought upon her by the subcontinent, where she had stood so many, and through whose plaguy fingers she was finally slipping. There was something else to it, too, her decision to bear Riley with the Barrett-Tromp. The old ladies whom she found repulsive and with whom she had nothing whatever in common, they attracted her in some secret, reluctant part of herself that she wouldn't explore. They appealed to some imprisoned whimperer inside her who wanted to be the old lady that she herself could never be, the old lady sunk into the mumbling, gossiping, repetitive consolations of old age, the gerontic nursery rhyme to which all the meaning and passion of life is reduced. So while she let the old ladies admire her, while she paused occasionally to let them talk to her for a few minutes, she was flirting with a perverse, anarchistic, almost tempting desire to abandon herself to them as if to a vice. Nothing of this rocked the pedestal of her dignity, of course. It's doubtful if, in her well-disciplined mind, the rumour of it ever got beyond the anterooms of her own consciousness, where, to maintain sovereignty over herself, she kept hanging about in the half-dark so much that she refused to recognize. "That hat suits you too beautifully, darling," Mrs. Green, the one who sat on the sofa in the entrance, said to her for the 20th time since her arrival at the hotel. The "darling" was like a pawing caress. Mrs. Hanson thought, with a faint thrill of horror, would she live to find the language of endearment debased from the communication of lovers to the small talk of old widows, whose glands, like the true occasion for the words, were withered? "All my hats are the same," she said. "Oh, I know, that's just it. You've got your own style. You can carry it off, never mind what the fashion is," said the fat woman, a schoolgirl whispering in a corner. "That's what they all say about you, my dear. There's some jealous of you in this hotel, I don't mind telling you either. Some that's not much themselves, and jealous, of course. I watch them all going in and out, and with all their feathers and flowers and what-not, it doesn't help. Not one of them's a patch on you, believe me. Mrs. Harris and I were saying only just now before lunch, you've got real dignity. That's born in you. That's what I say. Not one of them's got that dignity you've got, every line of you." "You looked like a queen this morning, honestly," said Mrs. Harris, turning her good ear to the talk and settling her bad legs, stuffed into her shoes like the legs of a cloth doll. Mrs. Hanson sighed, a little beyond them. She never quite talked to them. "Dignity," she said, and the one corner of her mouth went down in a slight smile, weary, hinted at. Her voice was always low, as if she wondered if they would understand her anyway, even if they happened to hear her. "You people talk about it as if it was something you could buy in a shop. I've lived in a lot of places. I've seen. My life has taken me—" She paused, and the word that followed took on a reference other than geographical. "About. You begin to look a certain way, just as a country person looks a certain way in a city. The opposite way, of course. I don't know about being dignified. But you don't find these things growing on trees, you know." For a moment she was one of them, an old lady herself, mouthing the familiar platitude of experience. "Dignity doesn't grow on trees." Not on trees. No, no. She knew very well where it had come from, that look on her face, that tone in her voice, that presence. She knew where and when it had been bought, as one is always able to find again in one's mind the exact circumlocution of back streets by which chance led to the little shop in a foreign town where, on a certain day, a particular piece of jewellery was discovered. And like an old trinket, or a letter never thrown away, she knew, under the accumulation of years, just where to put her hand on the memory. It was too weak a word for it. No, no, not on trees, or in shops, nor in the sort of experience that for these poor old creatures no doubt had passed for life. What would an unfaithful husband have meant to one of them? A return to mother, and the children to bring up on her own. No, no, not here. Not nearer dying than loving, nearer the dark grave than the dark bed, nearer the weight of earth on one's breast than the weight of a man. Not here, in a boarding house that outside smelled of cat and inside of old people. Far away from this, nearly 30 years away. She was not young even then, almost middle-aged, 43. But then women only begin to feel after they're 30. When she was a girl, she was nothing. Carl Hansen, her second husband, had come home from his office at 4:30 or 5 one afternoon and had told the driver to go. We won't need you tonight. But aren't we going to the harpsichord recital? She had said. They were living in Durban at the time. She could put the memory of the place like a shell to her ear and hear forever the majestic clanging of the lighted tramcars along the front at night. Shall we? He sat down in his big chair as if he never wanted to move again. Won't we get all the concerts we need in Europe next month? He smiled at her. He was rather an ugly man, really, but who would have dared to think of him that way? You had only to see the strap of his watch holding the quick, strong tendons of his brown wrist above his masterly, black-haired hand. You'd only to get that impatient glance sideways from under his brows as you opened a door and disturbed him, to feel the irrelevance of good looks. All right. I thought you were so keen to go. He shook his head, yawned, and settled himself with the paper, his whiskey, and his cigar. It seemed clear that he was there for the evening. She felt again a sense of security that ridiculously did not belong, as if everything were all right. Like many women who are desperate, she'd reached a state of mind when the desire to have things other than they are provides toeholds of credulity in the most doubtful of assurances. The wife of the drunkard cannot stop herself believing that the one night on which he stays sober is the reality, while the other nights were the nightmare from which she has awakened. Clara Hansen, every time her husband came home and read his paper in the evening like any other man, could not help succumbing to the feeling that he had never, so to speak, left the fireside. He had, of course, time and again. Once she herself had been one of his women. She had left her husband in order to marry him. It had not occurred to her that by marrying him, she was simply exchanging one position for another. Now someone else would be one of his women, and she would sit at home and be his wife. Her mother, of all people, seemed to have understood this and more. For God's sake, don't marry him. I tell you, he's mad, she had said. There's something wrong with that man, you'll see. He doesn't want you or anybody else. He wants everything. And that's something different. That's a madness. You'll see. Clara was 33 when she married Carl Hansen, and she did not speak to her mother for nearly 10 years after that. The conversation had horrified her so much that she flew into a rage at the mention of her mother's name. And in 10 years with Carl, she learned to understand that she had merely changed positions, that there was weight and counterweight, and they could not be one without the other. But she never accepted the situation. She began with suffocating jealousy, weeping and anger. I don't think I'll ever leave you, he said. She grew by tortuous processes, forcing herself to hold her hand in the candle flame of her passion for him, to cold reproach and the fear that, after all, he never would. and she came at last to begging him for decency's sake, in the name of the 10-year marriage, to give himself some peace from women. Whichever way she chose to do it, she'd never stopped fighting him. At first she fought him because she wanted him, and later she fought him because she didn't see why she should let go anyway. He was the torn and bloody rag of something whose original form and identity had been forgotten, but which was guarded in that name even more savagely than itself had been. She did not know what woman it was with whom he was spending his nights, that particular summer in Durban. She tried to narrow down his field of opportunity. God knows, she'd learnt long ago it wasn't possible for her to have women friends, because inevitably her husband found new lovers among them, and the only woman who came to the flat was a plain, timid, middle-aged spinster who spent a day there once in 2 weeks, sitting at the sewing machine, doing the household mending and repairs, and alterations to Mrs. Hanson's beautiful clothes. But who was to know what women he managed to meet outside the flat when he went about the town on affairs of business? She had no way of controlling this. She only knew that since just after Christmas he had begun not coming home from the office at all in the afternoons, and on those days when he did come, it was merely to tell her that he had to have dinner with some business acquaintances. The old lies, worn smooth, still served him. This time, of all the times there had been, she was exasperated. He looked so old, so past that sort of adventure. He looked like a man who is haggard with financial worries, plagued by reverses in his business plans. He looked like that. And it was nonsense. There was no need for it. He was an extremely clever businessman, and he and she were the sort of rich people who have their eggs apportioned between many foreign baskets, and are secure in the certainty that if some break, there will always be others, intact, elsewhere. There was no need for him to have that harassed air, the nervous, greenish shine on the line of his jowl, the wavering sigh as he sat down. It was simply some woman, that's all. Clara Hanson thought of her as she might have thought of the return of a chronic ailment that beset her husband. The evening of the harpsichord recital, to which they were not going, he sat on comfortably in his chair until dinner, looking up from his paper only once to ask, "What did you say we were eating tonight?" She had not said, but she answered inquiringly, "Duck, braised duck." "Ah, that's fine, then. Ask Alfred to take out a bottle of red wine, the Chateau Mouton." This small self-indulgence, like many rich people who have no need to be, they were careful with money and usually drank only South African wines when they were in South Africa, was somehow reassuring, was a pleasure in keeping with the dignity of a man in his late 50s. They ate slowly, and the bottle went fairly evenly between them. The candles burned softly, and she had about her, absolutely unchanged, the remote, hooded regard, calm and fascinating, that he had seen and immediately taken for himself when she was somebody else's wife. What happened then to change this mood? As usual, as always, she did not know. But suddenly, between hesitating about his emptied cup and the second cup of coffee, he got up, put the cup absently down, and went into his bedroom. He was gone only a minute. Could he have telephoned without her hearing the croak of the dial or the sound of his voice? But when he came back to the living room, his manner was changed. "I must go out for a while," he said. His face was the face of a man walking quickly along the street. She was never one of those jumpy women who react sharply. She turned splendidly, moving her whole full-bosomed body from the waist. Her lips were just parted, as if she waited for something, but then she closed them, and the right side of her mouth quirked once, in a disbelief of its own, before she said, "What is it now?" "I have to go out. There's a man I've got an appointment with in town. He's sailing tomorrow." "Oh, yes," she said. He came over to the chair where he'd been sitting before and took 2 cigars from the box on the arm and put them carefully into his breast pocket. She saw that he'd brushed his hair, but his face looked heavily lined. "Clara," he said from the door, "good night." "Good night." She heard his footsteps with the heels coming down hard along the corridors for a few seconds, and then they were lost in the sounds of the seaside place on a summer night that came in at the open balcony doors and seemed to settle around her silence. The sound of the sea, dark out there, 200 yards beyond the balcony, was always in your ears in the flat. It muted other noises akin to it, the sound of your own blood, the purr of a cat, and the noise of water running in the pipes. But at night, and in the absence of talk in the room, it brought with it, as the tide itself carried sugar cane from the rivers, ice cream cartons from the beach, and all sorts of refuse from the ships in the harbour, all the sounds of the living town that were adrift in the warm dark. First of all, the gliding grind and rattle of the trams on the front, and the clang as they swayed round the corner. Then the voices of the barkers at the amusement park, twanged and stretched and pulled apart by the wind. The hooting of young joyriders, the laughter of children up late, going for a walk with their parents after supper, the shouting of the big-voiced Zulus who cleaned the hotels, the tender pizzicato of their monotonous guitars as they strolled and played, the soft nasal putter of a phrase in some Indian dialect, caught up from the conversation of two Indian waiters, a wisp of song from the promenade concert on the beach. Clara Hanson took her second cup of coffee and let all these come to her. Somewhere, if you could separate the great rippling, bobbing tide of sounds one from the other, you would find the one small note, a door opening, a woman's voice, that was her answer. She sighed. She took up the evening paper where he had put it down on his chair. She never read the Durban papers. To her, they were the local gossip sheets of a foreign town, and nothing happened in the world until she read of it in the Swiss and French and German papers that came to her every week. The paper sank to her lap under her hand. She did not see the beauty of her hand either, with its long, plump joints and sapphire ring. She did not know where she had lost the ability of a young woman to find a moment of distraction in some example of her own beauty. She sat there a long time. The servant Alfred cleared the coffee things away, washed up the dinner dishes, and locked the kitchen door behind him. The city hall clock struck its wavering 9 blows across the town, and presently struck again, 10. She let her mind zigzag down into the past, matching this experience with that, finding this fragment in relation to that picture, and while she saw herself in the roles of the past, and sometimes dreamily recast herself in the course of some vanished afternoon, a thought stingingly of the present was formulating itself in that same mind. She ignored it wearily. It was an interruption she couldn't be bothered with, but it came again, and each time it was more insistent, more reasonable, more incredible. At last she got up, rather awkwardly, and went into her bedroom. It seemed she did not know what she had gone in there for. She took her dressing gown off its hook and put it back. She stood quite still a moment, looking round the room. The bunch of sweet-smelling, short-lived roses from the Indian vendor who hawked them up and down the front all day. The picture of her child in a little old silver frame. Suddenly she began to breathe fast, as if something inside her were racing. She went over to her wardrobe, took out a silk coat, and after the briefest pause, you could not keep your hair in place in the wind from the sea, a small hat. She put the hat on very quickly, looking at it but not at her own face in the mirror, and as she put on the coat, she appeared to remember something and stopped to examine, with interest, the place where a tuck had been stitched to shorten the fine, thin lining. Then she went out of the flat, leaving all the lights burning. Outside, on the front, the night air was so soft that it was a shock. It laid itself lightly, moistly, muffledly against her face. She breathed it, and it was not there, so that breathing it, you would wonder how you lived on something so meltingly substanceless. It swam around the looped lights of the front like glycerine, making them look like their own reflection in water. It drowned the glitter of the city in balminess. She did not feel it blowing, but it blew, sculpting the silk of her coat against her thighs and legs, and spreading the escaped tendrils of her hair against her hat. She went to the taxi rank on the corner and got into the first car. "Take me toward the docks," she said. "I'll tell you where, from there." She did not know the address exactly, of course. Who would bother about such a thing? But she knew which part of town it was in, and she had some idea of the name of the street. Haddon or Addo, something like that. The inside of the taxi smelled like a tired old sofa. She sat forward, watching the streets. It was not far to the dock area. "Do you know a street named Haddon?" "There's Adno Street, madam," said the man uncertainly. "That's it." And with the name of the street, the rest came to her too. Of course, Adno Street, 7A, Beryl Gardens. That's what I want. They drove quite far behind the dock area, into a suburb of semi-detached houses and maisonettes with old ragged palms struggling past the wooden balconies. When they found Adno Street, she suddenly said to the driver, "Drop me here." As he drove away, she began to walk quite briskly up the street, past a little crush of shops in darkness and plastered with advertisement signs of the chipped enamel kind, past the bar of an old, small hotel and along the double row of houses. She found she was on the side of the even numbers and crossed. She came to 7A, Beryl Gardens. And instantly it all seemed so unlikely and impossible that she walked on right past the house and round the block. It was a tall, narrow house, divided down the middle. On either side of the dividing wall there was a small veranda, a double window, a front door, and a concrete path leading a few yards down to the railings. 7A had half an old motor-car tyre made into a fern basket hanging on its veranda. The double window downstairs and its replica above were not lit up, but through the fancy, stained glass of the upper half of the door there was a glow that showed that there was some light in the room within. As she walked, her brain tingled with a sense of recovery from unreality. She felt as if a slap had brought her to her senses. Carl in that house? How could she have made such a fool of herself as to think it? No, it wasn't possible. Those ferns on the veranda. And what could there be inside such a house? Some poor soul sitting peacefully over the evening paper. When she rounded the corner onto the third side of the block that would bring her back to Adno Street again, she was on her way not back to Beryl Gardens, but to find another taxi and take herself home. There was a car parked in this side street. It was empty, and the lights had been left on. As she came on into the glare, hurrying now to the thought of the taxi, she half closed her eyes against the brightness, and then as she came out behind the orbit of the lights and level with the car itself, she saw that it was her car, Carl's car, their car. There were Carl's old driving gloves in the open cubbyhole. There was the yellow duster that the driver always threw onto the ledge under the back window. Yet she went slowly round the back of the car to look at the number plate, and she spelled the familiar number over to herself. A fit of trembling seized her. All the sanity and purpose of a minute ago was sucked violently out of her. "I could have died," people said of certain moments. "I could have died then and there in the street." For her, this became a rational statement instead of an exaggeration not really meant to be taken seriously. A hideous giddiness of the heights of emotion made her feel that she could fall dead in the street. It seemed that it was the only corrective of commonplace that saved her. Two Africans happened to come round the corner from Adno Street and passed on the other side of the street, chattering to each other, ignoring her. At once she began to walk steadily and fairly fast, but without haste, past the car that shone on into the empty dark, into Adno Street, and up to the gate of 7A, Beryl Gardens. The quirk of the corner of her mouth, that belonged to her particular kind of smile, was hardened into a tight downward pressure of disgust and unbelief. She opened the gate and went up the cracked concrete path. She had no idea what she would say. In all the other times they had been, she'd never shown herself to the women, never spoken to them, acknowledged their existence, except through her husband. If they'd happened to be former friends of hers, she had never received or greeted them again, once she'd come to know of the existence of the affair. She was aware of only one thing, the wish to be confronted with this, to force herself to look at it, to believe it. She rang the bell. Nobody came. She knocked First on the wood of the door, then a sharp tat-tat-tat on the coloured glass. The light behind it brightened. Another light had been switched on somewhere in the house. A woman's footsteps came slowly, paused on the other side of the door. Clara Hanson lifted her hand and knocked at the glass again. The door opened. Behind it, there was the mending woman, the dressmaker. Yes, her face, the pale, plain old maid who had blackheads in the creases of her neck and who sat bent over the sewing machine twice a month in the flat mending sheets. When she saw Clara Hanson, she stood gaping as if the punishment she had expected from God had come. She was unable to speak. Mrs. Hanson took her in from head to foot, a licking flame of a glance, and then it was out and cold. She said, "Tell my husband he's left the lights of his car burning." And jeering, mourning, she turned and walked out into the street before the eyes of the dressmaker, like a queen. I'm going to read you a story that requires just one word of explanation, because there's a sweetmeat in it, an Afrikaans thing called a koeksister. I just want to explain that this is a kind of donut, a kind of fried donut, a sort of twist of dough, very sweet and crisp and sticky. The story is called The Bridegroom. He came into his road camp that afternoon for the last time. It was neater than any house would ever be. The sand raked smooth in the clearing, the water drums under the tarpaulin, the flaps of his tent closed against the heat. 30 yards away, a black woman knelt, pounding mealies, and 2 or 3 children, grey with Kalahari dust, played with a skinny dog. Their shrillness was no more than a bird's piping in the great spaces in which the camp was lost. Inside his tent, something of the chill of the night before always remained, stale but cool, like the air of a church. There was his iron bed, with its clean pillowcase and big kaross. There was his table, his folding chair with a red canvas seat, and the chest in which his clothes were put away. Standing on the chest was the alarm clock that woke him at 5 every morning, and the photograph of the 17-year-old girl from Francistown whom he was going to marry. They'd been there a long time, the girl and the alarm clock, in the morning when he opened his eyes, in the afternoon when he came off the job. But now this was the last time. He was leaving for Francistown in the roads department 10-tonner in the morning. When he came back, the next week, he would be married, and he would have with him the girl, and the caravan which the department provided for married men. He had his eye on her as he sat down on the bed and took off his boots. The smiling girl was like one of those faces cut out of a magazine. He began to shed his working overalls, a rind of khaki stiff with dust that held his shape as he discarded it. And he called out easily and softly, "Oh, Piet, ek wag." "Old Pete, I'm waiting." But the bony black man, with his eyebrows raised like a clown's in effort and his bare feet shuffling under the weight, was already at the tent with a tin bath in which hot water made a twanging tune as it slopped from side to side. When he had washed and put on a clean khaki shirt and a pair of worn grey trousers and streaked back his hair with sweet-smelling pomade, he stepped out of his tent just as the lid of the horizon closed on the bloody eye of the sun. It was winter, and the sun set shortly after 5:30. The grey sand turned a fading pink. The low thorn scrub gave out spreading stains of lilac shadow that presently all ran together. Then the surface of the desert showed pocked and pawed for a minute or two, like the surface of the moon through a telescope, while the sky remained light over the darkened earth, and the clean crystal pebble of the evening star shone. The campfires, his own and the black men's over there, changed from near invisible flickers of liquid colour to brilliant focuses of leaping tongues of light. It was dark. Every evening he sat like this through the short ceremony of the closing of the day, slowly filling his pipe, slowly easing his back round the fire, yawning off the stiffness of his labour. Suddenly he gave a smothered giggle to himself of excitement. Her existence became real to him. He saw the face of the photograph posed against a caravan door. He got up and he began to pace about the camp, alert to promise. He kicked a log further into the fire. He called an order to Pitt. He walked up toward the tent and then changed his mind and strolled away again. In their own encampment at the edge of his, the road gang had taken up the exchange of laughing, talking, yelling and arguing that never failed them when their work was done. Black arms gestured under a thick foam of white soap. There was a gasp and splutter as a head broke the cold force of a bucketful of water. The gleaming bellies of iron cooking pots were carried here and there in the talkative preparation of food. He did not understand much of what they were saying. He knew just enough Tswana to give them his orders, with help from Pitt and one or two others who understood his own tongue, Afrikaans. But the sound of their voices belonged to this time of evening. One or other of the babies who always cried was keeping up a thin, ignored wail. The naked children were playing the chasing game that made the dog bark. He came back and sat down again at the fire to finish his pipe. After a certain interval, it was exact, though it was not timed by a watch, but by long habit that had established the appropriate lapse of time between his bath, his pipe, and his food, he called out in Afrikaans, "Have you forgotten my dinner, man?" From across the patch of distorted darkness, where the light of the two fires did not meet, but flung wobbling shapes and opaque, overlapping radiances, came the hoarse, protesting laugh that was, better than the tribute to a new joke, the pleasure in constancy to an old one. Then a few minutes later, "Pete, I suppose you've burned everything, eh?" "Boss? Where's the food, man?" In his own time, the black man appeared with a folding table and an oil lamp. He went back and forth between the dark and the light, bringing pots and dishes and food, and nagging with deep satisfaction in a mixture of English and Afrikaans. "You want cook sisters? So I make cook sisters. You asked me this morning, so I got to make the oil nice and hot. I got to get everything ready. It's a little bit slow, yes, I know, but I can't get everything quick. You hurry tonight, you don't want wait. Then it's better you have cook sisters on Saturday. Then I've got time in the afternoon, I do it nice. Yes, I think next time it's better." Pete was a good cook. "I've taught my boy how to make everything," the young man always told people back in Francistown. "He can even make cook sisters," he'd told the girl's mother in one of those silences of the woman's disapproval that it was so difficult to fill. He'd had a hard time trying to overcome the prejudice of the girl's parents against the sort of life he could offer her. He'd managed to convince them that the life was not impossible, and they'd given their consent to the marriage, but they still felt that the life was unsuitable, and his desire to please and reassure them had made him anxious to see it with their eyes and to forestall, by changes, their objections. The girl was a farm girl and would not pine for town life, but at the same time he could not deny to her parents that living on a farm with her family around her and neighbours only 30 or 40 miles away would be very different from living 220 miles from a town or village, alone with him in a road camp, surrounded by a gang of Kaffirs all day, as her mother had said. He himself simply did not think at all about what the girl would do while he was out on the road. And as for the girl, until it was over, nothing could exist for her but the wedding, with her two little sisters in pink walking behind her, and her dress that she didn't recognize herself in being made at the dressmaker's, and the cake that was going to have a tiny china bride and groom in evening dress on the top. He looked at the scored table and the rim of the open jam tin, and the salt cellar with a piece of brown paper tied neatly over the broken top, and said to Pete, "You must do everything nice when the missus comes." "Boss?" They looked at each other, and it was not really necessary to say anything. "You must make the table properly and do everything clean." "Always I make everything clean. Why are you saying now I must make clean?" The young man bent his head over his food, dismissing him. While he ate, his mind went automatically over the changes that would have to be made for the girl. He was not used to visualizing situations, but to dealing with what existed. It was like a lesson learned by rote. He knew the totality of what was needed, but he found himself confronted by one of the component details. If he found himself confronted by one of these, he foundered. He did not recognize it or know how to deal with it. The boys must keep out of the way. That was the main thing. Pitt would have to come to the caravan quite a lot to cook and clean. The boys, especially the boys who were responsible for the maintenance of the lorries and the road-making equipment, were always coming up with questions, what to do about this and that. They'd mess things up otherwise. He spat out a piece of gristle he could not swallow. His mind went to something else. The women over there, they could do the washing for the girl. They were such a raw bunch of Kaffirs. Would they ever be able to do anything right? 20 boys and about 5 of their women. You couldn't hide them under a thorn bush. They just mustn't hang around, that's all. They must just understand they mustn't hang around. He looked keenly through the shadow puppets of the half-dark on the margin of his fire's light. The voices, companionably quieter now, intermittent over food, the echoing chut of wood being chopped, the thin film of a baby's wail through which all these sounded, they were on their own side, yet he felt an odd rankling suspicion. His thoughts shuttled as he ate in a slow and painstaking way that he'd never experienced before in his life. He was worrying. He sucked on a tooth. Pete, that Kaffir talks such a hell of a lot. How's Pete going to stop talking every time he comes near? If he talks to her. Man, it's sure he'll talk to her. He thought, in actual words, what he would say to Pete about this. The words were like those unsayable things that people write on walls for others to see in private moments, but that are never spoken in their mouths. Pete brought coffee and Cook Sisters, and the young man did not look at him. But the Cook Sisters were delicious, crisp, sticky, and sweet, and as he felt the familiar substance and taste on his tongue, alternating with the hot bite of the coffee, he at once became occupied with the pure happiness of eating, as a child is fully occupied with a bag of sweets. Cook Sisters never failed to give him this innocent, total pleasure. When first he had taken the job of overseer to the road gang, he had had strange, restless hours at night and on Sundays. It seemed that he was hungry. He ate, but he never felt satisfied. He walked about all the time like a hungry creature. One Sunday he actually set out to walk. The roads department was very strict about the use of the 10-tonner for private purposes. He set out to walk the 14 miles across the sand to the cattle dipping post, where the government cattle officer and his wife, Afrikaners like himself, and the only other white people between the road camp and Francistown, lived in their corrugated iron house. By coincidence, they had decided to drive over and see him that day, and they met him little less than halfway when he was already slowed and dazed by heat. But shortly after that, Pete had taken over the cooking of his meals and the care of his person, and Pete had even learned to make Cook Sisters, according to instructions given to the young man by the cattle officer's wife. The Cook Sisters, a childhood treat that he could indulge in whenever he liked, seemed to mark his settling down. The solitary camp became a personal way of life, with its own special arrangements and indulgences. "Oh, Pete! Carol! What did you do to the Cook Sisters, eh?" he called out joyously. A shout came that meant, "Right away." The black man appeared, drying his hands on a rag with the diffident, kidding manner of someone who knows he's excelled himself. "What's the matter with the Cook Sisters, man?" Pete shrugged. "You must tell me. I don't know what's matter." "Here, bring me some more, man. The young man shoved the empty plate at him with a grin. And as the other went off, laughing, the young man called, "You must always make them like that, see?" He liked to drink at celebrations, at weddings or Christmas, but he wasn't a man who drank his brandy every day. He would have 2 brandies on a Saturday afternoon when the week's work was over, and for the rest of the time, the bottle that he brought from Francistown when he went to collect the stores lay in the chest in his tent. But on this last night, he got up from the fire on impulse, and he went over to the tent to fetch the bottle. One thing he didn't do. He didn't expect a Kaffir to handle his drink for him. It was too much of a temptation to put in their way. He brought a glass with him too, one of a set of 6 made of tinted imitation cut glass, and he poured himself a tot and stretched out his legs where he could feel the warmth of the fire through the soles of his boots. The nights were not cold until the wind came up at 2 or 3 in the morning, but there was a clarifying chill to the air, and now and then a figure came over from the black men's camp to put another log on the fire whose flames had dropped and become blue. The young man felt inside himself a similar low incandescence. He poured himself another brandy. The long yelping of the jackals prowled the sky without, like the wind about a house. There was no house, but the sounds beyond the light his fire tremblingly inflated into the dark, that jumble of meaningless voices, crying babies, coughs, and hawking, had built walls to enclose and a roof to shelter. He was exposed, turning naked to space on the sphere of the world as a speck of the fly on the window of an aeroplane, but he was not aware of it. The lilt of various kinds of small music began and died in the dark. Threads of notes, blown and plucked, that disappeared under the voices. Presently, a huge man whose thick black body had strained apart every seam in his ragged pants and shirt loped silently into the light and dropped just within it, not too near the fire. His feet, intimately crossed, were cracked and weathered like driftwood. He held to his mouth a one-stringed instrument shaped like a lyre, made out of a half-moon of bent wood, with a ribbon of dried palm leaf tied from tip to tip. His big lips rested gently on the strip, and while he blew, his one hand, by controlling the vibration of the palm leaf, made of his breath a small, faint, perfect music. It was caught by the very limits of the capacity of the human ear. It was almost out of range. The first music men ever heard, when they began to stand upright among the rushes at the river, might have been like it. When it died away, it was difficult to notice at what point it really had gone. "Play that other one," said the young man, in Tswana. Only the smoke from his pipe moved. The pink-palmed hand settled down round the instrument. The thick, tender lips were wet once. The faint, desolate voice spoke again, so lonely a music that it came to the player and listener as if they heard it inside themselves. This time the player took a short stick in his other hand, and while he blew, he scratched the stick back and forth inside the curve of the lyre, where the notches cut there produced a dry, shaking, slithering sound like the far-off movement of dancers' feet. There were 2 or 3 figures with more substance than the shadows, where the firelight merged with the darkness. They came and squatted. One of them had half a paraffin tin, with a wooden neck and other attachments of gut and wire. When the lyre player paused, lowering his piece of stick and leaf slowly, in ebb, from his mouth, and wiping his lips on the back of his hand, the other began to play. It was a thrumming, repetitive banjo tune. The young man's boot patted the sand in time to it, and he took it up with hand claps once or twice. A thin, yellowish man in an old hat pushed his way to the front, past sarcastic remarks and twittings, and sat on his haunches with a little clay bowl between his feet. Over its mouth there was a keyboard of metal tongues. After some exchange, he played it, and the others sang low and nasally, bringing a few more strollers to the fire. The music came to an end, pleasantly, and started up again, like a breath drawn. In one of the intervals the young man said, "Let's have a look at that contraption of yours. Isn't it a new one?" And the man to whom he signalled did not understand what was being said to him, but handed over his paraffin tin mandolin with pride, and also with amusement at his own handiwork. The young white man turned it over, twanged it once, grinning and shaking his head. 2 bits of string and an old jam tin, and they'll make a whole band, man. He'd heard them playing some crazy-looking things. The circle of faces watched him with pleasure. They laughed and lazily remarked to each other. It was a funny-looking thing, all right, but it worked. The owner took it back and played it, clowning a little. The audience laughed and joked appreciatively. They were sitting close into the fire now, painted by it. Next week, the young man raised his voice gaily, next week when I come back, I bring radio with me. Plenty real music. All the big white bands play over it. Someone who'd once worked in Johannesburg said, Satchmo, and the others took it up, understanding that this was the word for what the white man was going to bring from town. Satchmo. Satchmo. They tried it out politely. Music, just like at Big White Dance in town, next week. A friendly, appreciative silence fell, with them all resting back in the warmth of the fire and looking at him indulgently. A strange thing happened to him. He felt hot over first his neck, then his ears, and his face. It didn't matter, of course. By next week they would have forgotten. They wouldn't expect it. He shut down his mind on a picture of them, hanging round the caravan to listen, and him coming out on the steps to tell them. He thought for a moment that he would give them the rest of the bottle of brandy. Hell no, man. It was mad. If they got the taste for the stuff, they'd be pinching it all the time. He'd give Pete some sugar and yeast and things from the stores for them to make beer with tomorrow when he was gone. He put his hands deep in his pockets and stretched out to the fire with his head sunk on his chest. The lyre player picked up his flimsy piece of wood again, and slowly what the young man was feeling inside himself seemed to find a voice. Up into the night beyond the fire it went, uncoiling from his breast and bringing ease, as if it had been made audible out of infinity and could be returned to infinity at any point. The lonely voice of the lyre went on and on. Nobody spoke. The barriers of tongues fell with silence. The whole dirty tide of worry and planning had gone out of the young man. The small high moon, outshone by a spiky spread of cold stars, repeated the shape of the lyre. He sat, for he was not aware how long, just as he had for so many other nights, with the stars at his head and the fire at his feet. But at last the music stopped, and time began again. There was tonight, there was tomorrow, when he was going to drive to Francistown. He stood up. The company fragmented. The lyre player blew his nose into his fingers. Dusty feet took their accustomed weight. They went off to their tents, and he went off to his. Faint plangencies followed them. The young man gave a loud, ugly animal yawn, the sort of unashamed personal noise a man can make when he lives alone. He walked very slowly across the sand. It was dark, but he knew the way more surely than with his eyes. "Pete! Hey!" he bawled as he reached his tent. "You get up early tomorrow, eh? And I don't want to hear the lorry won't start. You get it going and then you call me. Do you hear?" He was lighting the oil lamp that Pete had left ready on the chest, and as it came up softly, it brought the whole interior of the tent with it. The chest, the bed, the clock, and the coy, smiling face of the 17-year-old girl. He sat down on the bed, sliding his palms through the silky fur of the kaross. He drew a deep breath and held it for a moment, looking round purposefully. And then he picked up the photograph, folded the cardboard support back flat to the frame, and put it in the chest with all his other things, ready for the journey.
Thanks for listening. 92nd Street Y Online Media is made possible by the generous support of listeners like you. For more audio and video programs and information about our wide array of upcoming events, please visit 92y.org. This program is copyright 2008 by the 92nd Street Y.